It's time to avoid the Serpent's Wrath in Bravo Wave 4 Searing Snakeway. This one's still pretty good, but it doesn't have nearly as much new to offer as previous maps, other than a new enemy type that moves left and right. It does have some gold to pick up for money, but that's the same concept that the weapons pickup did, just with more money. Interestingly, also makes use of a diagonal firing turret that doesn't trike you, but in a way that makes it more dangerous since you can't lead its shots. By this point, I'm well armed to deal with the threats even on elite difficulty, so it isn't too tough, but it has enough to make you grateful for the extra health fill. Overall, it's a map that doesn't have as many surprises as the ones before it, but it still does a very serviceable job in its own right. It's time to get bubbly and burning in Tango Wave 3 Searing Swamps. This one's more firmly into Tango's theme, more or less foregoing the Bravo elements completely, so it does feel more unique. Apart from that, I'd say it's merely okay, nothing all too exciting, but it's enough to keep you on your toes, so it certainly isn't boring. I actually almost thought the boss would be a midway boss since the screen scrolls up a bit past where you encounter it, but it's just the finale. This might be the more uninspired of Tango's maps so far, at least mechanically. Once you get around the cool swampy visuals, it's business as usual. It's not bad, of course, none of the maps so far have really been bad, but in a ranking some will be lesser. It's time to intercept some mad guns in Bravo Wave 2 Bulky Arms Deals. I'd say the main stars of this map are helicopters with very erratic patterns to throw you off and some bulky rusty colored ships I think of as more elites. Then there's also missile silos to add an extra ground target that your air missiles won't work on, so unless you bought something, better be fast with bullets. Amusingly though, this boss is the only one that doesn't have tracking rounds, so you can park in a corner and regenerate shields on lower difficulties. Though it's relatively smaller, it also introduces the idea of pickup treasures in the form of some guns, hence the nickname I gave the map. Ultimately, it's not as iconic as the first map, but it nicely escalates things in its own right, a real sweater on elite. It's time to don our helmets in Bravo Wave 3 Militant Base. This is actually a great map to farm money for a better weapon since the air-to-ground missiles you can get sell for a good amount of money. An auto-track minigun certainly makes the increasing number of both air and ground threats a lot easier to deal with. Elite mode is really starting to heat up now. As long as you're equipped with decent firepower though, this map is more than manageable and the extra amount of heat is well appreciated. It even has the air mines from the first map but now in 2 different waves instead of just one. Ultimately, it's a good map that really rises the stakes to a new level and is definitely a check for how well equipped you'll be to take on what's coming. It's time for one crazy light show in Outer Regions Wave 5 Loony Lasers. By now, I think the maps are starting to bleed together just a bit. This map doesn't have nearly as much going for it. The midway bosses have been fairly weak, probably because they usually show up later on in the sector, and the boss is a laser-spitting base. Healthy amount of bomb droppers, but that's the only thing I'd say really stands out about this map above the others. Plenty of lasers as you'd expect. It's probably to be expected this far into the game, but there really isn't that much new to say anymore. It's another solid and pretty tough map. I'm not saying it was bad, it's solid of course, but don't expect anything out of the norm. Even the aesthetic is the now standard moon visuals. It's time to feel the fire of the Lorax in Tango Wave 5 Lit in the Trees. For the most part, it feels like a pretty standard map with a mix of old and new visual elements. This changes with the boss, a grounded boss like Bravo's Wave 5, but 2 different targets and they're both equipped with lasers. While most of the map isn't anything too new, however, that hardly makes it a bad map since it's still very solid with a good amount of enemies. The farmland aesthetic is also pretty refreshing compared to valleys and industrial buildings that consisted of much of the game so far. Ultimately, it's still a good map with a pretty unexpectedly tough and different boss fight, which I think is worth an overall positive feedback. It's time to bring the bang in Bravo Wave 6 Bombastic Base. Well, if there's anything you still want to farm for, this map has an even more valuable weapon right at the start to easily sell off. You may need it because this map introduces midway bosses, although they're mostly repeats of the first 2 bosses with the second one enhanced. This map also introduces straightaway ships that lay down bombs in addition to those weird spinning ships that are a bit tricky to hit. Thanks to a farm to death ray, I got through the map without much issue, but it's still clear the game is starting to press harder on you, especially on Elite. Even though it retreads on previous bosses, the map otherwise distinguishes itself enough to feel fresh and is a good escalation of difficulty. It's time to get poked by the sky in Tango Wave 6 Air Force Thorns. Much like in the Bravo sector, Map 6 is the first one to have a halfway boss, even if this one was basically fodder to the twin laser if you have it. Don't get too sure of yourself though, because the final boss is armed with lasers itself and admittedly caught me by surprise and carved into me. Also, like Bravo, there's plenty of buildings and enemies laying down mid-air bombs too. Even the music is the same, so it's almost like a throwback. The map also gives you a shield fairly quickly if you want to farm those, so that's pretty generous of it, all things considered. Ultimately, it's another solid map that isn't the most original at this point, but it caught me off guard. It's time to get Raging Red in Outer Regions Wave 2, Base of Doom. This map has a different look than the previous one, looking more like Mars, which is a nice touch. It even places more emphasis on ground targets, both tanks and turrets, and even a final boss base with several parts. While there's certainly some turret lasers, there aren't any fast-moving laser ships, so it feels more like a bit of a breather in comparison to some prior maps. It's a solid map, nothing too new or exciting, but it's settled into a familiar pattern, which is to say still fairly challenging on Elite even with extra shields. It probably isn't reasonable to expect every map to feel completely new, but at least it gets the job done and funny enough has a very small midway boss. It's time to get stanked by Stank in Bravo Wave 8, Pulverizing Pollution. This continues the midway boss, but perhaps because a ground midway boss would be silly, it drops reusing bosses in favor of brand new ones. Interestingly though, it does bring back those carrier ships I personally like, in addition to revealing missile-spitting military green helicopters. Having a very polluted river from runoff in a lengthy factory near the end of the map is an interesting touch, clearly a lack of safety standards. As expected, it continues the trend of raising the stakes, making good use of fast plasma-spitting ships among other things. While it doesn't make the most original introduction of mechanics ever, what's there is solid and challenging enough. It's time to weaponize oxygen in Outer Regions Wave 4, Rusty Raid. Well, this map continues the trend of things getting more and more difficult, with even small-sized turrets casually firing lasers. Probably the most interesting thing about this map to me is the final boss, because the black design just really looks cool. Other than that, it's pretty much business as usual, variety of enemy types, and when the lasers come, you'll be clinging to those extra shields dearly. The Mars aesthetic provides a decent shift from the other more lunar or dark city type maps, and of course the red looks more vibrant too. Ultimately, the map is the most mind-blowing, but it seems like Raptor's played its hand by now. There isn't that much new to provide, but it's very solid. It's time to fear the unknown in Bravo Wave 7, Underground Surprise. This map follows the trend of a midway boss with reusing the 3rd and 4th waves as bosses. It also introduces stealth turrets that deploy out of the ground to catch you off guard, but funnily enough can be shot before they trigger. In general, this map definitely raises the tension by going even harder on you with enemies, and if you aren't well armed by now, you're in trouble. The mood is further enhanced by the music, which comes across as more of a wartime tragedy theme than previous more upbeat tracks. Ultimately, it's a good map that has a justifiable elevation of difficulty without going overboard. It's time for Human Bean Juice in Outer Regions Wave 7, Bloodstained Basalt. It's certainly continuing the trends of the wave, seemingly getting tougher and tougher. It's proving to be a genuine challenge. It also makes the slightly silly choice of having a grounded boss for a midway boss, meaning you're probably going to end up not destroying it. It also gives you the better version of the air missiles, though I had the twin laser at that point, so it was pretty useless for my purposes. Not too much to say, apart from that it gave me a tough time and the Mars aesthetic looks pretty nice for setting it apart. The maps may be starting to blend together, but it's still a satisfyingly challenging map all the same. It's time for Precision Trash in Tango Wave 7, Laser Pollution. This really takes the lasering game up to the next level, having laser bosses as the previous 2 waves, but adding a lot of twin laser enemies. Thankfully they're delayed to fire, but you better not be under them if you like the whole idea of living to fight another day thing. It's almost comical having such chaotic spikes of difficulty, having the more uplifting Bravo Wave 1 music. It's fun having contrasts like that. The aesthetic also goes a bit back to the industrial pollution, looking more like a Bravo map or Tango Wave 1 than the more jungle maps. Ultimately, it's a nice escalation of tension and goes beyond just being another solid but nothing special map. It's time to start the Church of Adam in Outer Regions Wave 6, Crater of the Crazed. Well, I have to give it credit for something. It's the first map to take me a few tries, even with all shielding. If you underestimate the abundance of plasma, laser, and other attacks flying everywhere, you'll be grounded before you know it. The final boss and midway boss actually felt easy in comparison, though the midway boss took more of a beating this time. Aesthetic is still lunar, but at least there are some variations like craters, and the map sneakily has decorative buildings that look like turrets. Ultimately, I feel favorably towards the map. It got out of the rut and felt genuinely threatening. I had to really try with this one. It's time to hit the nightclubs with missiles in Outer Regions Wave 3, Dark Side of the Moon. It seems the stakes have been increased yet again. This one actually has fast-firing laser ships to really make you treasure that gifted shield. Weirdly though, the final boss felt like a limp biscuit in comparison. Even the midway boss had the plasma shots to be a little deadly, albeit glass cannon. It's another Nightlife map, and they seem to be even tougher on you than normal, at least the ones encountered this far. Since it's still in the outer regions, you could say it's a dark base on another planet or something, hence the very creative name I gave it. While the concept may not be new, it isn't seen too often, and it's refreshing when it appears. Good, solid, and very tough map. It's time to be another cog in the machine in Tango Wave 1 Industrial Mayhem. Well, this map sure did skill check me because I was getting a bit wrecked until I decided to buy a shield, which is to say it's an effective starter. Thematically, it very much fits in with the last maps from Bravo, and if you choose to start straight on it, all I have to say is good luck with that. From this point forward, the Tango maps will develop a theme of their own, but it's nice to see that industrial transition from the two sectors. The only thing it resets, so to speak, is only having a final boss, but it honestly doesn't need a midway boss, and I'd have gone crazy if that boss was midway. In case it wasn't clear, it's a great map if you just beat Bravo Sector with a very effective mix of old and new. It's time to weave through boats and air mines in Bravo Wave 1 Offshore Mania. You might expect me to complain about the linearity, but I'll overlook it this time, and also, these will be done on elite difficulty, so no mercy. This map certainly isn't afraid to throw a lot of new concepts at you at once, from basic bullet and missile enemies to enemies that wildly swerve around. Even grounded boats, the map's included air missiles will do no good on, and aerial mines that try to head towards you to self-destruct. Interestingly, you start the game with 75% health and just enough to get a fill-up or a boss health meter, but the map gives you a free health pickup. Overall, it's a good introduction map that really shows you what you can expect from the game, especially on elite difficulty, and you'd best be ready for it. It's time to get a leafy welcome in Tango Wave 2. Welcome to the jungle! This is where the Tango sector starts to reveal its own unique theming, though not without some familiar elements still mixed in. Not too lengthy of a map, but it more than makes up for it in diversity, even a stealth turret which almost feels nostalgic in a way. It even brings back the air mines, which was nice to see them make a return since they always provide that unique pacing. Ultimately, this map feels like it's further transitioning from Bravo to Tango with more and more of its jungle theme bleeding through. It was challenging enough that even with the most powerful weapons in the game, I can just manage without an additional shield. It's time to burn until sunrise in Tango Wave 8 Neon Nightlife. This is a Night City map, which means it's a little hard to see and throw in plenty of laser shooting enemies in the mix. One nice thing is you can farm shields on this map and go beyond the buy limit, so don't be shy and stock up on them because I definitely did. Comparatively speaking, the midway boss and final boss actually felt pretty easy, even though the final boss also had a couple of lasers. Basically, don't expect this map to go easy on you. It's the penultimate map to the Tango sector, and it's not going to go down without a serious fight. Being a Dark City map also allows it to feel fresh compared to the jungle and industrial maps before it, so thumbs up for being something different. It's time to deliver some doom in Bravo Wave 5 Chaotic Carrier. I'm pretty sure I'm biased in my evaluation because I absolutely love this map. Maybe it's the music or the rare and fairly cool carrier type enemy. It's a bulky ship whose jet turbines basically break off to introduce two small ships, but you can pretty easily destroy the big ship before they deploy. It's also the first map to have a grounded boss, which was actually bad news for me at the time because the laser tracker gun doesn't hit ground targets. The music is also a real banger, one of my favorite video game tracks, and it plays in a few different maps to great effect. Ultimately, it's a very nostalgic map for me, and I know this is biased, but it's my ranking, so I'm going to place things wherever I want. It's time to navigate rock trees in Tango Wave 4 Concrete Jungle. This map straight up gives you a shield, and it's not hard to see why because it isn't messing around. Interestingly, it also seems to have tiny foot soldiers running around that you seem to be able to shoot, but it looks to just be decorative detail. Given the laser weapons are instant though, that means you especially have to be careful of the enemies wielding it and be quicker to get them. The abundance of buildings certainly make it stick out even mechanically, since grounded weapons will be stopped by them. I have to give this map credit, it surprised me with the difficulty spike, at least on the elite difficulty, and proved it still has some tricks up its sleeve. It's time to get out of the pan and into Outer Regions Wave 8, Volcanic Vindication. Perhaps the map's greatest strength is its aesthetic, centered around what looks like an active volcano. It also has the coolest ship design in the form of its midway boss, at least in my opinion. Other than that, it's the usual, which means you can expect a lot of resistance getting through this one. Actually died a few times. The final boss especially demands precision to get through its laser cannons without getting shredded. As a penultimate map, I'd say it does its job of really putting you through your paces, and it has a pleasing aesthetic on top of it. It's time to put one foot in front of the other in Outer Regions Wave 1, one small step. If you were expecting this map to be a nice transitionary one, you're wrong, because it both introduces you to the space aesthetic and reintroduces you to pain. It has a midway boss and no shortage of lasers. I pity the brave fools who actually attempted to go through this region first, though at least it gives you ground missiles to farm for. I do certainly appreciate how the visuals are sharply different, even many of the ships, to give it more of the impression that you're actually in outer space. Overall, it's a very good intro map, and it will shred you if you aren't careful. It's time to make shocking familial discoveries in Bravo Wave 9, Death Star Docks. This is the final map for Bravo Sector, and it certainly doesn't disappoint, throwing a lot of stuff at you and introducing a new ship of its own. I call it the mystery box because they could just have diagonal bullets, or they could also have missiles firing out front. You don't know what you're getting. The previous one's boss is actually the midway boss here, while the boss proper is what straight up looks like a Death Star and has to deploy itself. I find it pretty cool how it shifts into more of a dog base area near the end, and the abundance of enemies certainly does not disappoint. You better go in swinging. It's time to flash the Darkside in Outer Regions Wave 9, Emperor Lasers. This map is brutal. I know I've been dying a few times, but this one probably the most, with a similar precision final boss but even tougher. Fittingly, the map sort of resembles the Death Star, which I'm sure was intentional because it has a very Star Wars vibe. The toughness at least means it isn't ending off on a dud. It throws everything at you from lasers to a ton of trackers and everything in between. It doesn't have a midway boss, but it doesn't really need one either due to how utterly relentless it is, which may be why it doesn't. Even though the map had me furious with it at the time, I have to respect it for the sheer amount of bullet hell and pleasing aesthetic. It's time to face the wrath of Kong in Tango Wave 9, Bongo Congo. This is the finale map, so as you may expect, it doesn't go especially easy on you and piles on the expected lasers as well as bomb droppers. The notable thing is it takes those air carrier enemies I like and puts them on steroids with the final boss, carrying two smaller ships firing lasers. Other than that, the rest of the map is fine. Plenty of slower dual lasers and much faster singular lasers to really keep you on your toes. Given it's on Elite, I feel no shame in admitting I packed down the shields for this one, and it certainly burned through at least a few of them. As a bonus, it ends on the more jungle-bearing note, even has what looks like a Buddhist temple with a large statue visible after destroying the roof. It's time to debrief this pilot. Taken as a whole, I love this game in so many ways, from its gritty art style to its elevating tension of difficulty, especially on Elite difficulty. While the maps can feel a bit samey over time, none of the maps actually got boring, especially since by then a lot of the ships are firing lasers and can easily be lethal even with shields. It's also a pretty nice concept that the scores your funds that you use to get things like weapons, health, armor, and a scanner to see how much health bosses have. That, with the sheer amount of variety of enemies, locations, and weapons, honestly make it one of my favorite retro games of all time. Definitely give it a try if you haven't already.